At First United Methodist Church, we believe that everyone is a sacred child of God. You can help us share that message by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing to our channel.
The question I was asked for this Sunday had to do with what it means to be blessed. Specifically, the question was asking about how God seems to bless certain people and not others, and yet in the Beatitudes, we see that God blesses those who are struggling in life. And that there seemed to be a contradiction here, that maybe we understand blessing in a different way God understands blessing. And then the question asked if we were missing something in the translation. So I took that as my opportunity to kind of geek out on biblical languages, and you're all just going to suffer through it this morning. But I specifically chose to use the Beatitudes as recorded in the Gospel of Luke. First, because I think we don't hear those quite as often. We're probably very familiar with them in the Gospel of Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount. We probably don't hear Luke's Sermon on the Plain quite as often. But I also wanted to use the one in Luke because I think it lets us in on the fact that this was maybe a standard sermon of Jesus's. That maybe when he went around to a new place, this was the kind of sermon that he would often give. And then finally, I chose Luke because, for me at least, Luke's Beatitudes are a little more visceral. They're a little more human. I want to touch on a few things, though, this morning. First, I want to touch on that contradiction, how our understanding of blessing seems to be different than God's. Then I want to talk about the limitations of our language, that the word we use for blessing is actually a little bit different than what Jesus was talking about. And then I want to talk about how Jesus is taking something popular from his time, twisting it a little bit to make a point. But first, let's just talk about that contradiction. Because the things that Jesus says are blessed seem to be in direct contradiction to what we would expect a blessing from God to look like. And like I said, I chose Luke because Luke does this in a way that really drives the point home. And if you've never looked at the difference between Luke's Beatitudes and Matthew's, let me just give you some examples. Matthew writes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke writes, "Blessed are the poor." Matthew has, "Blessed are they who hunger for righteousness." Luke says, "Blessed are the hungry." Luke renders the Beatitudes more humanly, talking directly to human needs, and sometimes we're a lot more comfortable with those spiritual deficits than we are with the physical human deficits like poverty and hunger. So, in a sense, I think Luke's Beatitudes are more uncomfortable for us to hear. They're harder for us to say, yeah, I can see where there could be a blessing in that. But at the same time, understand that the people that have come out to hear Jesus speak are, by and large, those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who are feeling put upon day in and day out. It's not the people that are living the easy, comfortable lives that are coming out to hear Jesus speak. It's those who are struggling every single day who come to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," he's not talking about an abstract concept. He's talking to the poor. When he says, "Blessed are the hungry," he's not talking about some abstract concept. He's talking to people that are literally hungry at that moment. This teaching of Jesus does, though, seem to fly in the face of what we would expect from God. Why would a God who fed the hungry wanderers in the wilderness with manna say something like hunger is a blessing? Why would God look upon abject poverty and say that there is a blessing in poverty? Maybe you've noticed the contradiction in your own life. And I'll use the idea of financial deficit just as an easy example because there's actual hard numbers that I can give. The average income for everyone in the world, when adjusted for purchasing power, is somewhere around $18,000 a year. That is, the average person is living on what you or I would say is $18,000 per year. And I did not do so good in math, but I know that the average means that half are living on less than that. So for any of us who live on more than $18,000 a year, we might look and say, how is it a blessing to live on less? And yet Jesus seems to suggest that it is. Or consider if you are in good health. How many people you know who aren't? And you might think it is a blessing to be in good health. And yet, notice the contradiction, because I think Jesus would invite us to think that those who are sick might have a blessing. Or think of it in family dynamics. Some of us are blessed with healthy families where conflict is minimal. And yet we look at so many of our neighbors who have families that are just rife with conflict. And we might say, I am blessed because my family is not. Maybe God is punishing so-and-so, and yet Jesus seems to suggest that conflict is blessed. There seems to be a contradiction between what Jesus says and our lived reality of the world. We don't see things like extreme poverty or hunger or illness or violence as blessings. We see them as very much things that we would like to avoid. So there is a contradiction in what Jesus is saying, but I think we can understand that contradiction by actually understanding what Jesus meant when he said, "Blessed are they who." Now, Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The Gospels were written in Greek, but Jesus' upbringing, his culture, would have been steeped in the Hebrew language. And in the Hebrew language, there is a word that means blessed, and that word is Baruch. Specifically, that is a term that would be used if I were to say, God has brought a blessing into your life. And that's how it's always used. We don't bless one another in the Hebrew language. God brings a blessing into someone's life. Blessing is always God initiated. That's not the word that I think Jesus is using, though. Like I said, Jesus, we don't have him speaking in Hebrew here, but he would have understood this concept because his contemporaries were using very much the same language. And his contemporaries were not using Baruch when they said, "Blessed are they who." Instead, they were using the word ashrei. It's another Hebrew word. And I think that is the concept behind the Beatitudes, ashrei. I'm going to give you some examples, both from the Old Testament and then from those who lived in Jesus' time. The first I want to give you is from Psalm 1, and I'm going to put words up on the screen here. The truly ashrei person doesn't follow wicked advice, doesn't stand on the road of sinners, and doesn't sit with the disrespectful. Instead of doing those things, these persons love the Lord's instruction, and they recite God's instruction day and night. They are like a tree replanted by streams of water, which bears fruit at just the right time, and whose leaves don't fade. Whatever they do succeeds. So this is Psalm 1, verse 1. The first verse of the first psalm talks about ashrei. And when it uses the word ashrei, it uses it in the context of having an abundance. The psalmist gives that imagery of a tree that produces fruit at just the right moment. At just the moment of your hunger, the tree produces fruit. Its leaves don't fade in seasons. It just continually produces and produces as needed. That's the image of ashrei. So we might think that in Hebrew, the word ashrei means abundance, means provision. Let me give you a second example from the book of Psalms. This is Psalm 2. So kings, wise up. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord reverently, trembling, kiss his feet, or else he will become angry and your ways will be destroyed, because his anger ignites in an instant. But all who take refuge in the Lord are truly astray. All right. So in Psalm 2, astray seems to be about God's protection, safety in God, finding security. So which is it? Is astray about abundance, or is it about security? Well, yes, it's about both. Because I think the best way to understand the Hebrew word astray is not to say blessed are they who, which is one way that we have translated it. But I think it's more of a concept of pointing at someone else and saying, that person has the good life. I asked on our social medias this past week for people in the church to share with me what the good life meant to them. I got 2 responses. So I don't know if you all just don't spend your time on social media, which I applaud you for, or if, nobody knows what the good life is. But I wonder if you have ever seen somebody living what you would call the good life. Maybe they've got the good job, the good house, the good family, the good vacation plans. Maybe that is the good life. But that's the way the word astray is used in the Hebrew scriptures. It's used, instead of God has blessed, it is people just like us looking at others and saying, hey, that's the good life. And in fact, in Jesus' time, teachers would go around and they would pontificate on what they thought the good life was by saying, look at so-and-so. That person's got the good life. You should be more like them. Let me give you a couple examples of that. In the Wisdom of Sirach, if you have one of our good Protestant Bibles, you will never have read this. If you came from the Catholic tradition, you might have. But 2nd century BCE, Wisdom of Sirach writes, I can think of 9 whom I would call astray, and a 10th my tongue proclaims. A man who can rejoice with his children, a man who lives to see the downfall of his foes. Astray is the man who lives with a sensible wife. He was not sexist, I'll give him that. And the man who does not plow with ass and ox together. Astray is the one who does not sin with the tongue, and the one who has not served an inferior. Astray is the one who finds a friend, and the one who speaks attentive to listeners. How great is the one who finds wisdom, but none is superior to the one who fears the Lord. So 2nd century BCE, in the Wisdom of Sirach, we almost see a prototype for the Beatitudes, where in this wisdom, we look at others and say, blessed are they who, or astray are they who. Astray are they who act in such a way, who have these right relationships. I don't know why people are blessed for not plowing with 2 different animals, but astray are those who do so. But notice, in each one of these blessings, these good life comparisons, it is always looking at what someone else is doing and saying, that's astray. That's the good life. Let me go a little closer to the time of Jesus, to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran community preserved these writings in the desert. They were translated about 30 or so years ago, or at least this one was. And this scroll read, blessed is he who speaks truth with a pure heart, and who does not slander with his tongue. Blessed are those who cling to his statutes, and who do not cling to her ways of perversity. Blessed are those who rejoice because of her, and who do not spread themselves in the ways of folly. Blessed is he who seeks her with pure hands, and who does not go after her with a deceitful heart. Blessed is the man who has obtained wisdom and who walks in the law of the Most High and applies his heart to her ways, who cherishes her lessons and ever rejoices in her corrections, but who does not repel her in the pain of his misfortunes or in the distress of trial, and in bad times does not abandon her, who does not forget her in days of terror, and in the humility of soul does not reproach her. So you see now a community that was contemporary to Jesus is offering a teaching on blessings that seems very familiar to those of us who have read the Beatitudes. But it is still one of those things where we are looking to people who we might say have a better life and saying, that's the good life. Those are the people who have got it figured out. Live more like them. Astray your neighbor who has the good life. So the people who come out to hear Jesus' sermons, whether it be the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew or the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, the people that come out to hear these sermons would have heard all this before. They would have had teachers coming through their communities telling them how they might live the good life. We still have that, don't we? We still have coaches and lifestyle gurus who point out how others live and say, that's the good life. That's what you should be striving for. The people that came to hear Jesus speak would have heard it all before. They would have heard all opinions on what it meant to have the good life. And then here comes Jesus with the Beatitudes, pointing at them maybe. Instead of saying, look at so-and-so over there who has the good life, Jesus says to the people who are poor and hungry and struggling that they have the good life. Jesus takes this idea of what a good life is, flips it on its head, and reimagines it. And instead of saying, look to your neighbor, envy what they have, struggle to have what they have, he says, you already have the good life. And it's not going to be defined by your successes or your failures. That's not the mark of the good life. Maybe we would say the good life is innate to who these people are. That's not about wealth or poverty or hungry or flourishing. The good life is simply there because God has blessed it. God has welcomed them, God has invited them, and that is the marker of a good life, to be welcomed by God, to stop looking to others and to start looking to being invited by God. Now there is a blessing. That was all about astray, but there is a blessing to be found here because each beatitude comes in two parts. Blessed are they who, for there shall be. Blessed are they who are poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom. That's the form of the Beatitudes. That's the form of these blessing teachings. So the good life is the first part. The blessing is the second part. The blessing is things like inheriting the kingdom. The blessing is not that you will be poor or hungry or weeping or hatred. The blessing is that God's kingdom is yours. You will be satisfied, and maybe even that you will laugh one day. So in the Beatitudes, Jesus flips the expectation, shows us that the good life has nothing to do with having the big home or the perfect yard or the summer evenings by the lake or the early retirement so you can travel the world. That's not the good life. The good life is not about figuring this life out perfectly or navigating it excellently. The good life is being welcomed by God and extending that welcome to others. And that the blessing doesn't come from the things we accomplish in this life. The blessing comes that we are beloved of God. The good life is yours. Be blessed knowing that you are beloved of God. Let's be in prayer. God, so many times we have looked for the good life in other places. We have looked for it in lives of ease and comfort. We have struggled with it when we see ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our families hurting and longing. Lord, help us not to look to the things of this world to define what a good life is. Help us look to those relationships with you that are defined by welcome, those relationships that we form with others that can be defined by acceptance. Help us look at that as a good life, and help us see that the blessing of eternity is what follows. Lord, I thank you for blessing us in this way. It reminds us that whether we succeed or fail does not define the goodness of our lives, but whether we love as you have loved us might. I pray in Christ's name. Amen.